Good morning and welcome. My name is Alvino Mario Fantini, and I am the editor in chief of the print quarterly and news and analysis website called The European Conservative. Welcome to the European Conservative's second public event in Brussels. We opened a Brussels office in January and had a launch event last month, which was quite a success. We were surprisingly warmly received by even liberal and progressive journalists here in the belly of the beast. MEPs attended. They were delighted to see us. And we had many friends from around Brussels also join us. Today, in our second public event, we will look at some of Europe's legislative priorities according to the document that was released in December. Now, that document, a joint declaration, wasn't an extensive document. It was several pages, but it identified 6 legislative priority areas for the legislative session of 2023 and 2024. Before I get into why we're focusing on that document and why we're focusing on some of those legislative priority areas, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the European Conservative and why we're here in Brussels. I mean, the truth of the matter is, today, with technology, you can report on the news and conduct analyses and write essays and treatises even from anywhere in the world. So why come to Brussels? It's simply because of this. We realized in the last year or two that if we really want to engage with some of the biggest threats to freedom, to the idea of subsidiarity, to the idea of a true or real democracy, that we had to engage more vigorously and more robustly with what was coming out of or emanating from Brussels. We had to engage critically and perhaps push back against some of the language, some of the policies, let's call a spade, some of the propaganda coming out of Brussels. So we decided to open this office and turn our analytical, probing, and critical eye squarely on the EU. And where else to do it from than their own doorstep? We're just a few minutes away from the Parliament. And our goal, our overall goal, our fundamental purpose here in Brussels is to basically try to make understandable to European citizens, to the average man and woman on the streets of various capitals and towns and villages of Europe, what is coming out of Brussels, what the bureaucrats here are planning for them to improve their lives, presumably, to make things better for them, supposedly, and to try to help them understand what will be in the works in the coming years. I referred to that joint declaration that came out in December of last year. It was issued and signed by Roberta Metsola, President of the European Parliament, Peter Fiala, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic and President of the European Council, and Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. That brief document identified 6 pillars or legislative priority areas, and I'm going to list them very briefly. First, to deliver the European Green Deal. It's no coincidence that that's listed first, because as I think we all know, greenness, the green agenda, the European Green Deal encompasses all aspects of our lives. Number 2, to achieve the digital transition, which, to be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure what it means, but fortunately today we have an expert with us who will try to unpack that term for us. Number 3, to move towards an economy that works for people. Now, I found this one amusing because in my studies, in my experiences, people are parts of an economy. People participate in economic activity. I've never seen it phrased this way, to work towards an economy that works for people, as if the economy was something different and apart from people. Number 4, to move towards a stronger Europe in the world. Number 5, to promote our European way of life, open to debate what exactly that means. And the last, to protect our democracy and values. Now, these are all noble, lofty sounding words and phrases and terms. They suggest a lovely, better future for all of us. Who would be against this language, this kind of agenda? But it's the typical language used by the world's international bureaucracies and multilateral institutions. Now, I should add that I've worked for some of these multilateral institutions and some of these bureaucracies. I've even drafted documents using this kind of language. But I was never allowed to question it, being on the inside of some of these institutions. I've been emancipated. I'm free, and now I can question what these terms, these words, these phrases really mean. And I think my suspicion all along is being proven that they tend to obfuscate, they tend to make opaque things that people don't want you to understand fully, and they tend to hide an agenda. Today's event, our second event, as I said, is a sort of curtain raiser in the sense that we hope to begin a discussion around the 6 legislative priority areas, a discussion to be had with MEPs, with experts from across Europe, to explore and debate what exactly the EU means by these legislative priority areas. To begin with today's curtain raiser, which will provide an overview for the next several months, we've chosen 3 of the 6 legislative areas: digital transition, the Green Deal, and security, with a focus on migration. In our upcoming monthly events, we will seek to provide further context and some background to these 3 areas. Now, today, we've assembled 3 experts who have joined us to explore these 3 areas. Each is a specialist in his area with extensive experience, and we will look at and discuss questions such as, what is contained in this brief document that I mentioned, these 6 legislative priorities? I listed them very briefly, but each is accompanied by several paragraphs of even further jargon, which, if you have insomnia, I recommend you use it to help you at night, because you can read it and it's either dizzying or simply puts you to sleep. But behind it, there is an agenda, make no mistake. We're going to discuss what is the real agenda behind all this. We will discuss how this will affect ordinary Europeans, which is probably the most important question. And we will discuss whether or not this is really a path forward for Europe. So thank you for indulging me with that. Now I will introduce our 3 experts who have joined us today. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. First, to my left is Dr. Norman Lewis, and I'll summarize his background. It's quite extensive. He's a writer, a speaker, a consultant on innovation and technology, an international expert on future trends and technological innovation. Extensive experience in Silicon Valley, currently the managing director of a consultancy called Futures Diagnosis, a visiting research fellow at MCC Brussels, a think tank, formerly a director at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, responsible for their crowdsourced innovation program. Prior to that, he was director of technology research at Orange France Telecom. And he has other roles as an advisory board member, executive board member, and committee chairman at various corporations and organizations, all focused on technology, telecoms, mobile communications, etc. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lewis. I'll introduce all 3 speakers, and then we'll turn to them for their comments. Next, we have, next to Dr. Lewis, is Pierre-Marie Sève. Thank you for joining us. He just arrived from Paris, so thank you for making the journey, despite whatever challenges.
24-hour journey.
24, yeah, no, if only it were a joke, right? Pierre-Marie is director of the Institut pour la Justice, Institute for Justice, a French think tank dedicated to justice, security, and migration issues. He holds a law degree from the Sorbonne, and his work focuses on generally building a more effective judicial system in France and providing greater protection for victims of crime. And I'm delighted to have seen that on your background, because a lot of leaders and policymakers seem to have abdicated any responsibility for security in Europe's capitals. It's shameful, really. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. And then we have Peter Klepp, my good friend I've known for about a decade. Peter is the Brussels-based policy analyst he has various roles, I should point out. First, he's the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu, which I highly recommend. They keep a watch on all EU matters. But he's the Brussels-based policy analyst with several institutions focusing on EU affairs, Brexit, and the Eurozone. He's also an international research fellow at the Property Rights Alliance, based in the US, a frequent commentator for European and international media, has published in places like National Review Online, The Spectator, or Specky for those who refer to it with affection, and The Daily Telegraph. And from 2008 to 2020 was the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, a think tank organization, multifaceted organization covering EU policy and Brexit issues. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. I understand each of our experts has perhaps a short statement. We'll start with Dr. Lewis, and then I'll pepper you with questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be part of your initiative. I think what I'd like to do is to start with the point that you made, which was just try and decipher some of the language that we see in all EU documents, particularly around digital. And so we see phrases like human-centric approach, the protection of consumer rights, privacy, data protection, particularly protecting young people on the internet, etc. And you think to yourself, well, who could disagree with that? I mean, it's like your genial grandfather is kind of looking out for you, and he's going to, implement laws that are going to protect you as a citizen. And but when you decipher this, when you actually get beyond the rhetoric and see what this actually means for ordinary Europeans, you see something very, very different taking place. And I would argue that what is happening, particularly in the digital sphere, and this is really I suppose the key point to be made about the digital transition, is the fact that the EU are very consciously using digital as a means of exerting what I would call their digital sovereignty, the sovereignty of the EU. It's an attempt to play at geopolitics where the EU is particularly weak, because that's the contradiction. Technologically, there are no European big tech companies that can compete with the big tech companies, which are all either Chinese or American. And when you look at the digital transition, particularly, I haven't got time to go into this, but I'll just mention the Digital Services Act, which I don't know if many of you understand, is now law in Europe. And the Digital Services Act is essentially the legalization of content regulation on the internet, a principle that nobody seems to be opposed to. There's been very little murmurs about this. And what's so hilarious about this is that this human-centric approach is that the EU have implemented this law without any consultation with the millions of people that use these services in Europe who are going to be impacted by this, because now the EU has the ability to dictate what can and cannot be said. The areas that are particularly concerning are areas of protection around hate speech, disinformation, and emergency powers that the EU Commission now has, that they can declare a crisis over a particular issue, and they can then dictate about what can be said and not said on the internet around this. And I think it's absolutely shocking to me what this is, how powerful this is and what ramifications this is going to have. And just to be clear, this is not just about Europe. This will become a de facto global standard, just like the GDPR legislation. the EU is able to use digital in the way that I'm suggesting precisely because it controls the single market. And access to the single market means that it can dictate certain terms that every company has to comply with if they're going to do business in the European Union. That's what's called the Brussels effect. And essentially what it is, I would suggest, is the Brussels bureaucracy, the political elite in Europe, dictating behind the legal form of jurisprudence. So they pass a law which essentially means that they themselves are not seen to be censoring the internet, but they put the onus on that onto big tech. And big tech has got no choice, but they have to do this. I'm not suggesting that big tech are not immune from censorship themselves. We've seen what they did with the standing president of the United States, for example. It's not that they're principled against it, but to do business, they themselves will just simply say, look, if we want to serve our millions of customers in Europe, we have to comply. And they then are not culpable. The Commission is not culpable because they're not doing it. It's big tech that's doing it. So through this new law, they assert what they call the rule of law, which essentially means that they abrogate any responsibility for what's actually going on, but will impact the lives of millions and millions of people. And this is just absolutely beyond contestation that that's what's going to happen, because we know where this goes with regard to content regulation. So the point I want to make about digital and about digital transition is that the EU are consciously using this as a way of asserting European position within the geopolitics of the world today. And the problem for me, the big problem, besides what I've just said, is that referees do not win football matches. The real weakness behind all of this is that Europe does not have the technological sovereignty that its competitors have. And that's what they're trying to compensate for. That's essentially what they're doing. They are using digital and regulation as a way of trying to fight above their weight in the world, caught between China and America. My final point on this is that being a regulatory superpower means that they're very good at innovating around regulation, but they're not very good at innovating. And the problem with regulating around innovation is that you are stuck in the present because you cannot regulate for things that don't yet exist. And so what this means for innovation is that you are seeing the world as it is now and assuming that that's how it's going to be in the future. And it means that the technology and the laws that you bring in, say particularly around artificial intelligence, means that you're already closing down the space within which innovation can take place in Europe. And I think what the consequence of that is that for startups in Europe, they are being ham-fisted, they are being tied with a hand behind their backs because they are now having to comply with an enormous amount of regulation in order to operate. And that costs money, which they don't have. And so what the consequence of that is going to be, which is what we've seen up until now, is that European startups leave Europe. Particularly they go to America. Well, I'm not sure how that's going to work out now with Silicon Valley Bank, the problems that they've got with that. But that's what they've done. They've had to leave Europe in order to become successful. Or they've been bought by American companies, which is what happened to DeepMind. And so the real problem for me in this is that this really does not serve the people of Europe because it's actually cutting people off from the future innovation that might disrupt markets, that might create the kinds of companies that can compete with the Googles and the Amazons and the Metas and et cetera of this world. We need more of them, not less. And I think there's a kind of self-defeating dynamic that's being established through this digital transition. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. Before we go to Peter, let me make a comment disguised as a question. I naively thought, perhaps like many of you, that this digital transition would represent providing incentives to expand the technology sector in Europe, or that it would somehow, I don't know, improve our ATMs or move us towards cryptocurrencies, or somehow stimulate the blockchain technology and its many, many applications, or perhaps move us toward a digital democracy. But what you said, if I understood you correctly, is that while it may include many of those lovely things that I just listed, it really has a different motive behind it. Is that correct? I understood you correctly.
Yeah, yeah. I think to just expand that slightly, I think it's the kind of law of unintended consequences. Because if you think about the core elements of the Digital Services Act, which is to clamp down on what they call disinformation, the real thing that they are concerned about is that through the internet, Putin or somebody else will be able to hijack elections, will put out, chatbots and whatever, and that the ordinary people of Europe are just so stupid and gullible that they're going to be swayed by disinformation. And it's really contempt for the people of Europe that's driving that. But it's disguised as a law that is there to protect them. This is what's disingenuous about the whole thing. It's the form of this is the legalistic form, and deliberately so, because as you said, it's there to obscure. It's there to really hide the agenda, because what's really behind this is that they are fearful of the European electorate. They are not going to involve the European electorate in this discussion, because basically they're saying to the European electorate, we don't trust you. We think you'll be influenced by people, populists or whatever, people that have got different values to what the technocratic values are of the European Union, which is why they're always going on about it'll be done according to European values without ever specifying what those values are. And what that means in effect is that we've got to get beyond or pierce the legal form of this in order to really understand politically, culturally, and socially what's driving this, what is the context within which this takes place. And that's I think there's not many people doing that. And me being here in Brussels and being part of working with the MCC Brussels outfit is to try and penetrate that and to try and expose what's really behind all of this.
Good. I'm glad to have you here, and that's also one of our objectives, to try to penetrate or understand this stuff. Because most people, if you're like me, when faced with something obscure or obscurantist language, what do? You move on. You say, well, I don't understand it. I'm not prepared. Maybe I'm not qualified to understand it. So you move on. And what you do by moving on is abdicate any role you have in determining the outcome of your democracy. Peter, let's talk about the green economy. I understand from yesterday's news, I think, that there is a new doctorate holder among us who is a specialist in the environmental movement and climate change, etc. We don't need to focus on her, but tell us what you've been doing regarding the green economy in the last several years.
Well, thank you, Mario, and for inviting me here. So basically, the European Union has its European Green Deal. And what I'll do is I'll try to sum up what that involves. It's basically a whole range of legislative proposals to sort of make to improve the environment. Ultimately, at least that's the pretext. As you know, the European Commission has the monopoly to propose legislation. Afterwards, the European Parliament and the member states have to approve it. And then even in that stage, the European Commission is constantly intervening and trying to shape and lobby it. So one of the things that they want to do is to sharpen up the CO2 emission reduction targets. And they want to go to 55% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. That's one thing, but they also try to micromanage how EU member states reach this target. They say you have to have a minimum of renewable energy. Now, what's the problem with that? At least from my view, is that at the moment only I think 4% of global energy generation is coming from wind and solar power. These are the most well-known renewable energy sources. So just to show you how far we still have to go, and these energy sources are not necessarily environmentally friendly. There's no proper solution for processing of solar panels. Also, with wind mills, there's big problems. It's also not very nice to see them in the landscape. That's maybe more subjective. Also, by trying to promote this particular way of reducing CO2 emissions, we become more heavily reliant on China. It's one thing to say, Germany and Europe have been too dependent on Russia. Well, now we're passing legislation to make our economies more dependent on China. Maybe we should think a little bit about that before we do it. Also, fundamentally, there is a technology that generates a lot of electricity with almost no CO2 emission, and it's nuclear power. And surprise, surprise, the European Commission is not very keen on nuclear power. You would almost think they don't really care all that much about CO2 emission. And it's even worse because there's a treaty, the Euratom Treaty, which obligates EU member states and therefore the EU to promote nuclear power. But the Commission is clearly not very keen. We all know it's held hostage by a whole raft of green NGOs that also don't really care about CO2 emission. If they would love nuclear power, but they love concepts like degrowth. We need less economic growth, according to that kind of mindset. Another proposal in the whole context of the Green Deal is promoting the circular economy, which involves a hostile approach to plastic. They don't really get how important plastic is, but anyway. Then building renovation, that was in the news last week. The European Parliament voted in favor, a majority anyway, of mandatory building renovation. This is a very big deal. Already we have all kinds of EU standards implemented in national law. I think you all know the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate. Now, from a certain point, it will be mandatory if you want to rent out your house or apartment, if you want to sell it, or even if you just want to continue to live in it, to achieve a certain level of isolation and energy performance. Now, if you say, well, that's my problem, I don't think this massive investment is worth the cost, that won't fly anymore. There will be a legal requirement to invest and make investments that you'll never recover. Today there is an article in Handelsblatt, German leading newspaper, detailing how for many owners of real estate the choice will be to basically sell it off or make massive investment that will likely never be recovered. So it's just mind-boggling that a majority in the European Parliament, which shows you how out of touch that institution is supporting this sharpening up of already very sharp obligations. There's a lot of protest, thankfully, of course, coming from countries like Italy that have very old, often beautiful housing, and where this is an almost impossible challenge. Then what else do we have? We have biodiversity. We have farming, of course. They want to regulate farming heavily. This will involve sharpening up the nitrogen emissions. You all saw the big farmer victory in the Netherlands last week. I think great thing, really a popular movement in all 12 provinces of the Netherlands. We saw the Farmer Party prevail, showing you it's not just the farmers, it's not even just the farmer communities. I mean, this is a vote against the kind of technocracy that comes with the European Green Deal. But this, the farm-to-fork part of the Green Deal will involve stricter nitrogen standards, because we should know that a lot of the obligations that force Belgium and the Netherlands to crack down on nitrogen emission is coming indirectly from the EU level. It's a bit complicated. There's also some national responsibility there, is both. So the EU wants to double down on that. Of course, less pesticide, more green subsidies for farmers, less emissions. requirement of 25% organic agricultural by 2030, and I think I'm not against organic agriculture. The contrary, it's great, but this is actually not necessarily good for the environment. You need more land for organic farming. Then what else do we have in the European Green Deal? Innovation they want to push, which is basically spending more money, translated from EU lingo. They are preparing to spend €1 trillion, 260 billion a year, to promote stuff like clean hydrogen. Now, why are they so wild about hydrogen? Because they admit that the problem with wind and solar power is that it's very useful. It only does not produce the energy or the electricity when you actually need it. So you need some kind of a battery. And they have come up with now promoting hydrogen to basically allow hydrogen to become some kind of a battery, a storage facility to store the energy produced by intermittent energy sources like wind and solar. One problem, according to Professor Fourfari, a former top commission official, you have about 80% loss of energy when you in the process of storing your energy in the hydrogen battery. But that, of course, will not prevent the EU from massively subsidizing this whole thing. Now, what else do we have? Of course, promoting public transport and electric vehicles in public transport, which makes it even more expensive and dysfunctional than it already is. Then we have the Fit for 55 plan, which involves, and I'm sure you've followed that, a ban on the combustion engine. Now, the combustion engine has been invented in Europe by Daimler, right? And they want to ban it because the bureaucrats already know that electric vehicles are superior. So a normal reaction would be, well, if they are so great, I'm sure people will naturally adopt electric vehicles. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. There's many good arguments against it, but many good arguments in favor. No. Just to be on the safe side, they want to ban the existing functional technology for something as important as transport. You know, most people use a car. Only people who live in cities do not often use a car, but most people in Europe badly need cars. So on top of all the restrictions, European and national, on cars, we're going to have this. Thankfully, Germany has U-turned. It's no longer supportive. Italy is helping Germany with it. And at the moment, the debate is raging on you know, what will come out of this. Then, of course, I'm almost finishing. There's the response to the American Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act will not reduce inflation. For some reason they gave it that name, but it's basically just another mass subsidy or fiscal support program. One problem is to support green energy development. One problem is that only American and Canadian companies can profit from it, which has alarmed European industry. They see it rightly as protectionist. Now, what the European Commission is pushing for is protectionism to fight protectionism. Fire to fight fire. They want to come up with a new fund, the European Sovereignty Fund, on top of the mass budgets that you already have at the EU level. There's quite a bit of opposition to that. Thankfully, the EPP is even against it. Often the EPP goes along with all of this. We'll see what will come out of that. But however, what they have already decided is to water down the ban on state aid. This is very important. You know, the core of European cooperation, the EU is far from perfect, but the idea is that, look, let's create a framework where whether you're a small or a big company, a small or a big country, everybody is equal. You can't just have politicians picking winners and throwing cash at a company they're friendly with. So that's sort of the central idea. Over the years, the European Competition Commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, once called the tax lady by Donald Trump, she has not properly done her job. She's not very keen to go after, European member states throwing cash at companies, and now in response to the American legislation, she has proposed to water down state aid rules further. I mean, or to extend certain exceptions that have been decided because of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. They always find an excuse. That's very concerning, because this relates to the heart of European Union cooperation. You know, if we don't even have the ban on state aid, this core legal framework, then I think many people will start to wonder, okay, this is no longer just an imperfect institution. I mean, what good is it actually still doing? I'll mention one more thing. Apart from the fact that there's been warnings from European industry that there may be industrialization as a result of this. Europe has become a lot less competitive in the last 3 years, partly because of this extreme green over-regulation. That we have the European Union's climate tax. It's not called the EU climate tax, it's called the emission trading system. They basically force levies on industries and sectors to get the right to emit CO2, and they're able to trade that. So it's sort of a cap and trade system. Well, they're expanding that to ever more sectors, to housing, to transport. And then they say, well, it's very unfair that in Europe industry needs to compete with the rest of the world when we have this very expensive climate tax, effectively, which they have implemented themselves. And to compensate for that, they will have a new tariff. It's called the CBAM tariff, and it will impose. It's basically a climate tariff on import of steel. They're still designing it. It's probably violating the WTO framework. But so it's basically then protectionism to compensate for the domestic climate tax. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure there's sadly many things I still have not mentioned. But,
that's the tip of the iceberg, I think.
I think it's fair to say it's completely out of control.
Thank you, Peter. Just two comments. One, very brief. Have any of you ever driven an electric car? And then compared it to the old-fashioned combustion engine car? Huge difference. I don't know any normal person who loves driving an electric car. It doesn't have that man-machine connection. You know, that's a throwaway comment, but it was worth pointing out. But more importantly, I want to, before we turn to you, which a very important topic to me as well, I'm thinking a lot about the worldview or the philosophy behind much of what you've just described coming from the EU. And I'm thinking about one of the people who helped start the European Conservative was the late Sir Roger Scruton. Now, of course, he has a very important book called Green Philosophy, and he's written many essays about what true environmentalism looks like. And it's all imbued with a love for the land, a love for nature, a love for all the things that a normal, sober environmentalist would defend. And yet it's in stark contrast to the kind of worldview that I think lies behind much of this, which is all about control and forcing us to adopt lifestyles that we don't want to adopt, that people who are the farmers you mentioned, that would make their lives harder and would make their livelihood poorer than perhaps it already is. So can you briefly perhaps talk about that fundamental division between the worldview of a real environmentalist like Roger Scruton and these guys down the street in Parliament and their idea of what it means to defend the environment?
Yeah, I'm following this Twitter account. I think you like it. It's called Culture Critic. And they basically posted a picture of New York City. And they said, if you live in this urban jungle, you're not really an environmentalist, which really caused so much anger in the comments. And I think, yeah, I mean, of course, there's many genuine environmentalists, I'm sure, living in New York City. But I think he's touching upon something there that typically the urban Greens, or they call themselves Greens, that they actually haven't got much of a connection with nature. Farmers have, hunters have, and I think that's also quite telling in the kind of political opinions they take. If you go to these European regulations, that ultimately it's not hard to debunk that this is not gonna improve nature. Sometimes it will, I'm sure. Not everything is bad, but often not. Like their mad support for wind farms. I mean, wind farms. Like if you go to the Belgian coast, I'm from close to the coast to the Han, you can see these ugly wind farms at sea, and then we will need to build high voltage cables over land to get the energy from the sea to where it's actually needed, which is in central Belgium, in the port of Antwerp, the chemical industry cluster. That's where you need the energy, not in the North Sea. So from an environmental perspective, a lot of it is just completely,
I would
negative.
summarize it this way. It's fundamentally the division between a true love for the land, a true love of nature, versus a love of power and control. On that note, let's turn to migration, a very important security issue facing Europe. Now, I don't know if you have opening comments you'd like to make, or that'd be wonderful. Please, go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to talk about migration and security. I'm not saying there's any link between the two concepts. That doesn't seem to work. I don't know if
Here.
Okay. So I'm not saying there's any kind of link between migration and security. It just happens I'm going to speak about these two subjects. I want to read first what the legislative program is, and that we saw in the legislative priorities for the EU for 2023 and 2024. And there is this, it's very short, so I'm going to read it to you. To promote our European way of life, we will give absolute priority to finalizing the reform of the migration and asylum legislative framework before the end of the legislative term, based on the joint roadmap on the Pact on Migration and Asylum. So this is what they say, and once again, as what my two colleagues said earlier, there's the words, the official words, which in that case doesn't indicate much of what they're going to do, but there's behind the rhetoric. And so this particular Pact on Migration and Asylum, it has 4 main points. Well, first of all, it was a bit surprising because, as you may know, Czech Republic is now presiding the EU Council. So it was surprising to see the Czech Republic, but that's another subject. So in that Pact on Migration and Asylum, what they officially say is they're going to improve solidarity with relocation. Maybe you saw that in the last few years. Relocation was an important issue with Hungary and Poland. So relocation, mandatory relocation between the EU member states, negotiation with countries of origins of the migrants, and financial helps. These are the 3 ways EU country member states are going to be able to exert their solidarity between each other. Only 18 countries signed that pact in the end on solidarity matter. The second point is they're going to end Dublin regulation. That's what they say. In the end, we don't see how they're going to end it. It's true, it's old. Maybe it has to change, but it won't change much from what we have seen so far. The third point is harmonization, to harmonize the asylum system. This is a very important point for the EU Commission and the Court of Justice of the European Union. They're already doing it, and they have been doing it for quite some years now, in the recent years. And they want to facilitate legal immigration. And among other things, they want to introduce a single permit throughout the EU. So this is the official. These are the official words they use and their official message. But in the end, I'm like Saint Thomas, and I believe what I see, and I believe what I have seen so far. And so when you look at the history of what the European Union pushed and influenced, and how they influenced public policy throughout the European Union. So on migration and on security, first it's when I studied law in France, we used to say, our professors, they used to say, the criminal procedure is really the heart of the sovereignty of the member states. It's one subject that the EU they don't want to touch. They won't touch, but in the end, they did. So I'm going to give you not I'm not going to pretend to completeness, but I'm going to give you some examples. There's the 2002 framework decision about the European arrest warrant, the 2013 directive on the right to a lawyer, the 2016 directive on the presumption of innocence. But I'm going to take one example among others, that to me shows the concrete effects of what the EU's policies create in the European Union. So it's a decision of the Court of Justice. So you probably know, but the two main influences on most public policies are first the European Commission and second the Court of Justice. In my subject on security, the Court of Justice has a tremendous influence, and they did a lot of harm. But and so. The 6th of October of 2020, the Court of Justice ruled that the national laws could not force phone operators to transmit their clients' data to governments, even if we're talking about people that are suspected of terrorism or people suspected of having committed a serious crime, I quote. And only this example, this is a constant change of legal provisions, have hurt many police investigations and also make, of course, future police investigations harder for the police to succeed and to solve the cases. And this is a real issue. I'm not talking about just it's something that the police will have to adapt to. It is a real issue. I talk to police officers all day, every day, and what they tell me, and what they all tell me, that it's been 20 years. They cannot solve their cases as easily as they could. And at least in France, we see it. There was a report made a few months ago, an official report by Cour des Comptes. So it's one of our many institutions, but that works well. And they're saying that the crime-solving rate is declining in every single crime in France. And the main reason is because the criminal proceedings are changing all the time, and they're always going into the same direction in favor of the criminals' rights. And so this is a real issue, but that's a single example on security. On migration, the Court of Justice has been very active and very vocal about its will to ensure the application of the Pact on Migration and Asylum, as I read it to you earlier. So of course it's not the Pact of Marrakesh. Maybe you remember that, the Pact on Migration. It has a similar name. It's not the exact same thing, but it is. It has the same philosophy, and the EU heavily supported the Pact of Marrakesh. So it's a bit different, but it has the same philosophy. But over time, so if I go back in history, what happened is, I'm going to take many examples. The first subject that the EU wanted to influence was the illegal immigration policies all over Europe. So today, thanks to the European Union and to I think it was the Court of Justice, being an illegal migrant is not considered a crime anymore. It is, of course, in the United States, in Canada, or pretty much everywhere else in the world, but not in Europe. It used to be in France, for example, but pretty much every country in Europe, it used to be a crime, and you could be arrested for being an illegal. If you cross the border illegally, of course, it should be a crime. But now it's not anymore. And the Court of Justice refused on many occasions any sort of criminal proceeding based on that ground of being illegally entered in the European Union. And as always, national parliaments, they all complied, and they all repealed the laws they had making being an illegal migrant a crime in Europe. But also, countries that wanted to go their own way on immigration, probably because they had a specific situation. So I'm thinking of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. They faced some massive illegal immigration following the great statement made by Germany that they would welcome 1 million refugees. So Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, they took action, and of course the Court of Justice prosecuted them and condemned them in the recent years. So they said that Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, it was a decision of April 2nd, 2020, that these countries had violated the EU law by refusing to apply the EU mandatory relocation of migrants. So that's one of many decisions. I'm going to give you another, condemning Hungary. The May the 14th of the same year, 2020, Hungary has been condemned for keeping an illegal migrant for 4 weeks inside a transit zone, awaiting for its asylum request to be examined, and it was subsequently refused. On December 17th, the Court of Justice again condemned Hungary because Hungary planned that migrants entering the country from neighboring Serbia could only present their asylum requests from transit zones and not anywhere else in the country. And that goes against EU law, according to the Court of Justice. So this is what they do, and what their justification is behind is, as I see it, is always the common European values. I'm just going to say a few words on that because it seems important. It seems important to me. So officially, there are the European values that have been decided by the court, of course, the Court of Justice, and the European Commission, and the treaties. The European values are supposed to be inside the treaties. So first, in 1957, the Treaty of Rome talked of two European values. It was peace and freedom. But they have been growing heavily over time. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty talks of freedom, democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, and the state of law. Next, the Lisbon Treaty of 2007 now talks of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between men and women prevail. So we're getting at 15 values, but this is not over. We also have the Charter of Fundamental Rights that was signed in 2000, I believe, that was ratified in the meantime, adding another 54 values, including the quality of the environment, social exclusion, solidarity between generations, free trade, children's rights, etc., etc. This is, to me, it seems to me like a polytheism of values. We have many gods in the European Union. They have no real hierarchy. We don't know which one is really more important than the other one. And they in the end, they constitute a pool of values in which the different European institutions, the Commission and the Court of Justice, can pick whatever they want. Well, they pick arguments for whatever decision they want to do and they want to make. So these values are supposed, and that's a problem, these values are supposed to be common to all member states because, as I told you, Hungary, Poland, among others, there are hints that maybe they're not that commonly shared. And so in the end, to me, what the EU promotes on the subjects of migration and security, it's an ever-growing defense of individual rights at the expense of the collective interest of European societies. For example, just one example, there was a terrorist attack in France. We have many, but in Nice in 2020, we had one where 3 European citizens died inside of a Notre Dame church of Nice, so in the south of France. And had Italy and France had been able to arrest the terrorist for being illegally entered, because he was an illegal migrant, he had entered a few weeks before, these 3 European citizens would still be alive. And we talked about, when you introduced me, you said that I fight for, in France, I fight for equal rights between more rights for the victims against the criminal. Well, the European Union has been really following the opposite. And under the justification of non-discrimination, illegal migrants and natives, suspected criminals, and honest citizens, they're all considered the same. To me, that is not justice. To me, that is the opposite.
Thank you. To me as well. I agree with you.
I think we all agree.
what you just outlined is almost the classic definition of mission creep. You start off with 3 very tightly focused values, and then suddenly you said 54 plus at the end.
54 plus 15 at least. I'm probably forgetting some.
Incredible. So we've heard a dazzling array, and dazzling not in the positive sense, not in a way that you admire things, but a just dazzling array of things in these 3 sectors. We haven't even touched on the 3 other areas listed in the legislative priorities, which actually terrifies me to think about what that would look like. What has emerged, at least to me, is a clear divide between what all these programs and initiatives and legislative push are trying to achieve and what the average Europeans actually need, right? Is this simply a matter of a power grab by the EU over decades, many years? Is this because we have the wrong kind of people running or working for these institutions? I'm going to throw this out there. I'd like your diagnosis of like what is going on here. Why is this happening? Speak to the average European who is not following policy reforms or efforts or legislative agendas here in Brussels. Speak to the people back home who are working every day and trying to raise their children. What would you say to them regarding what's going on here? Anybody?
Well, if I can just continue on, well, it's pretty close to what I said a bit earlier, but to me, it is a real question that we have a lot of in France. Should we leave the EU or not? That's
a Frexit.
Yeah, we hear it a lot, and it's true that when I told you I listed all the European values or so-called European values, they're really at the core of the European treaties, and to me, it raises the question to. Can we really reform it? Can we really stay in this system when these anti-European values are so deeply put, so
embedded deeply into these structures and mechanisms, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't have the expertise. I couldn't say yes, France should leave the EU. I don't know, but it's true that it raises many questions for me on the possibility to reform it in any ways or to just leave it.
That word reform always makes me want to run because I've seen so many efforts over the years in the US and in Europe and in Latin America of reform efforts funded or financed by the World Bank and the UN, et cetera, None of it has ever achieved anything. Reform does not seem to work. Am I right, Peter? Or am I overstating the case?
Well, so yeah, I was for 12 years with Open Europe, which was a British think tank committed to reform of the EU. And I think we were quite deep in the debate, and yeah, we made some great suggestions, and there was actually there's many people in Europe, even in the institutions, support of it. And at one point, then David Cameron demanded concessions. But ultimately, he didn't get anything. Only Poland really made some concessions that were material. Angela Merkel did not care. I mean, one of her many failings in her career. And then the British wisdom in their wisdom decided that the upsides were no longer greater than the downsides. And I think, actually, there was a comment piece in Sweden last week, written by somebody from the free market think tank there, Timbro, their EU expert. And he basically warned that Sweden was going the same way as the UK, or that the debate was going in the same direction, because of at some point, if you see what's going on at the EU level, if there's no response to the fact that you have more and more populist parties winning elections, more and more people that used to be always in favor of the EU expressing doubts, more and more evidence of the immense cost of this whole system, of the benefits going down. I mean, cite an example of where the European Commission has been successfully opening up trade recently within the EU. The insurance market, it's completely clogged up. Like if you want to have an insurance for your pet, if you live in Belgium, I'm told it's cheaper to get an insurance in the UK because it's a bigger market. Whereas, you know, the European market should be bigger. It would deliver great benefits for Europeans, and maybe you can have a bit of cost of regulation then as the price. Fine, but if you don't have that, at some point people will ask, like the British people, what is this good for? And of course, I'm from the Benelux. For us, the cost has to be extremely high for you know, the exit to become worthwhile. But I think that for Scandinavia, this is a very different estimate, especially if Sweden and Finland are now going. Well, Sweden not are going to join NATO. Then that argument sort of no longer flies. So yeah, it's mission creep. It's ministers preferring to do business in Brussels rather than in the capitals with the scrutiny of the media, which is much weaker here. So yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Rose, you have a comment.
Well, I think there's a much deeper crisis than I think whether we have a discussion about whether you can reform the EU or not, I don't think it's reformable. I think because it's an expression of a much deeper problem, which is not just confined to the EU, to Europe, it's across the whole Western world, which is a kind of loss of faith in the Enlightenment, in progress, in democracy itself. And what we see the trend occurring everywhere is this kind of technocratic, you know, avoidance of engaging with ordinary people, of using the law, hiding behind this. So, you know, the German government, the French government, the British government, when we were part of the EU, would hide behind the EU. And so it's not us, it's them. You know, this is the law. They passed the law. It's exactly the point I'm making, that the use of law is the way that the EU avoids its illegitimacy, because it's not accountable to the very people that it's passing the laws whose lives it's going to directly affect. And that's a major crisis. And that's not something that you can resolve through a little reform. This requires the rethinking and the re-establishment and the invigoration of the basic tenets of democracy, of democratic accountability, of the citizens in countries, you know, holding their politicians and the legal process to account, which is, well, it just seems to me that what the EU is a kind of enshrinement of what's happening in politics across the West, which is, you know, this abrogation of responsibility, just hiding behind the fact that they are responsible for this, but they don't want to be accountable for it. And it's all legalistic and et cetera, et cetera. But as I say, I think there's a very deep crisis here, you know, which affects all Western politicians.
And we're talking about politicians, but at least from a French point of view, the judges are doing a lot of harm to the European citizens. And I'm not talking only about the EU, but also the Court of Human Rights, the ECHR. And even at a national level, and I'm sure it happens all over Europe, at a national level, our judges, they just implement what from the European Union or the ECHR, judges tell them to do. So, and to me, at least from a Romano-Germanic point of view, our judicial system is not supposed to enact law. It's not supposed to work like this. There's a famous quote from Montesquieu, Montesquieu in English, I guess, that is, the judge is supposed to be the mouth of the law. This is our tradition, and now in the European Union, I don't see maybe Ireland, that is a common law system, but I think all the rest of the countries, there are Romano-Germanic. So this is not our tradition. Judges are not supposed to enact law and to decide what is wrong and what is good. They're supposed to interpret it, maybe, what the sovereignty said in the parliament. But today, where does the people get his voice heard in the institutions? Nowhere. So,
go ahead.
I fully agree.
I just think France is a great example at the moment with what Macron just did.
Yeah,
You know,
France, the Netherlands,
yeah, it's just
other places.
extraordinary.
Well, we're now getting to the nut or the kernel or the heart of the matter because we're talking about the lack of accountability of not just EU officials and agencies, but also the what some people call the managerial or ruling elites in Europe, across the world, and the growing discontent, anger, and frustration on the part of just average working people who are not part of these processes, don't know what's going on in their name, presumably, and are beginning to take to the streets. We've seen the Dutch farmers. We saw the Gilets jaunes a year or two ago. I'm convinced we're going to see more of this. And I'm tempted to say, unless something changes, but what is going to change? What does that look like? Can any of you forecast something? Thanks, Peter.
I always say that no problem. There's no problem that cannot be solved with an increase in interest rates. And you know, they're trying to increase the interest rates because inflation is out of control, and it's going to remain out of control. I don't know if you saw today there was a prank, a Russian prank that managed to get Christine Lagarde to speak off the record, and she admitted that they haven't. They're struggling to control inflation. I mean, which is not a big secret, but it's interesting. So if you have higher interest rates, there's less money. They can spend less. They don't have the bureaucratic capacity anymore for technocracy. So I don't want to uniquely approach this from the economic side. There's deep cultural underpinnings to some of the malaise, I'm sure. But yeah, I do believe that because of the fact that the United States has the global reserve currency, that they can just continue many of the bad policies much longer, much more, aggressively than would be possible otherwise. And I very much deeply believe that the euro. I'm not against the EU still, despite its problems, but I'm very much against the euro, the common currency, because it has good things, but fundamentally it allows debt levels to rise to much higher levels than would otherwise be possible. And they're going to manage, I'm afraid, to suppress the increase in interest rates, and ultimately we will continue with the mass bureaucracies that we have as a result, and otherwise simply they would not be able to afford all those officials.
Dr. Lewis.
I think to your point about what's happening with interest rates and all that, if you're a technocrat, which is what we're talking about, then your claim to legitimacy is technical. It is that you can run things, that you can do things better than anybody else, and when that doesn't work anymore, then that's going to raise some very big questions in the minds of ordinary people, which is precisely why we see these outbursts occurring now increasingly. I mean, the Brexit vote, was something that nobody was expecting. Because there was a debate that took place that kind of raised the real issues, and people made a conscious choice. Thankfully, and I think and that's precisely what I think the EU is desperately trying to avoid, is that there's that kind of consultation and possibility of things being overturned, which is why they will tighten things even further. Which in the end is going to act against them, because, as I say, when you're a technocrat and your society doesn't work, and interest rates are going up, and inflation is out of control, and people are losing their jobs, and the lights are not working, people are going to do something about it, and that's what's going to happen. I'm all in favour of that as it happens, and we can use the technology to do that, by the way.
I'm curious about, was in the Netherlands more democracy one of the main demands of the, because it was exactly this in France with the Gilets jaunes. One of the main objective was to get, how do they call it? Direct referendum. If 50,000 or maybe 100,000 people ask for it, there would be a direct referendum on a specific issue, as they have in Switzerland. And to me, the main answer to all the problems we're talking about, or the least bad answer, would be more democracy. And so we have a neighbor, because they're not part of the EU, but we have a neighbor, which is Switzerland. We should take a look at what they do. And of course, the more people get educated and they get knowledge and they want to be heard, and they have they have opinions on matters, and they want to be heard when. So of course, as time progresses, democracy should progress, and we're very lucky to have a terrific neighbor doing a great job with democracy. I think that would be probably one of the ways to solve at least some problems.
You know, it's very interesting that you mentioned Switzerland, because I've noticed in the U.S. growing calls by some writers and analysts that we should all be looking towards Switzerland as a model. The cantonal system, the direct democracy, the referendums, and perhaps there is something to that. The likelihood of that happening, probably zero, right? Now, you mentioned something about the attitude or the mentality of those people who think they know better. They think they know what the rest of us need. I mean, that is the essence of hubris. That's the definition of hubris. There is a hubristic or arrogant, self-important attitude that I think permeates all these institutions, whether it's here in Brussels or the national capitals of our countries. Macron, if I may say so, exemplifies it in many ways. Yeah. In the U.S. as well, Canada, there's an outstanding example of that kind of hubris.
Dictatorship of the experts.
It's dictatorship of the experts, which reminds me, when was it? During the Brexit year and the year that gave us Trump for 4 years, it was Nassim Taleb, the financial writer, very interesting man, wrote in Zero Hedge that what we are seeing is the emergence of a global riot, an extended global riot against the pseudo-experts. And I love that expression. And I think that global riot didn't end with the disappearance of Trump. Well, the momentary disappearance of Trump. We don't know what's going to happen. But I think it's something that's evolving and growing, as I said earlier. I think we're seeing little expressions of populist revolt and anger. And so in our last 5 minutes, I'd like to ask each of you either provide a recommendation for the few bureaucrats here in Brussels who might be listening and watching to us, or to the average European citizen of what they should do, what they could do in the coming years, if anything. We'll start with you.
Well, I mean, my message would be that just don't forget who the people are, because in particular with the digital, where you are pushing the onus of censoring and controlling content on the internet onto big tech, and big tech is compliant with that. At the end of the day, everybody and big tech is nothing without us. Right? Everything that big tech does is based upon our data. It's based upon their business models. It's based upon our willingness to engage with those services. And it's a very important reminder to them that, okay, they might be beholden to the EU bureaucracy, but at the end of the day, it's going to be us who's going to determine whether they're going to succeed or not. Because, you don't have to use Twitter. Right? You don't have to go on these platforms. You can create alternatives. You can switch off. You can stop doing this stuff. And, then they'll take notice, because without us, they are nothing.
So a great refusal to engage and participate.
I would say we should, as citizens, try to escape the illusion that some people take care of us in Brussels or Strasbourg or wherever. We're speaking of power. Power lies in Brussels now. It used to lie in France. It used to be in Paris. Less and less, but power. You don't beg for power. You have to take it. And I'm not advocating what's happening in France right now, but how I see the evolution of the Court of Justice, how they really fought for power over time, and they took it, and now they have it, and they have it more and more. And they're going to have it more and more. If we want more democracy in the European Union, I don't believe it's going to come from bureaucrats. I think the citizens have to take it. I don't know in what ways, but we have to take it. It's not a gift. And it's an illusion now that we all live in, that we live in a what we call a democracy, but no, we don't live in a democracy, especially in France, where we have a semi-presidential regime. But in many countries, the average citizens, except maybe for Switzerland, but it's probably the only case in the world, the only country in the world that is in that case. Power is a matter of fighting, so, and not begging.
Thank you. You have the final word, Peter.
Well, it's of course not easy to change the world, and that's a good thing. Otherwise, we would live in a left-green dictatorship. But I think what you can do in your own modest way is, I still believe in the ballot box, not to have unrealistic expectations, but try to figure out the least bad politician. Maybe vote or abstain if you don't find anyone. Yeah, we see in the Netherlands at least it can sort of throw a shock into the whole media landscape and perhaps politics eventually, Brexit. Also, I think something important to mention, which I find not enough people do, is to buy physical gold. Not to put your whole wealth in it, but at least a part of it. Because not only do you protect yourself against the inflation that is likely to continue in the next few years, but also you sort of dramatically shrink. If everybody would do that, at least with 5% of their income, then European welfare states and all the technocracy, they would be badly hit. So if only the conservatives in Europe would all do that, you would see a very quite a big effect already, I think.
Now, that's a fascinating topic that I'd love to have another panel on someday, just alternatives to the current monetary and financial system. But anyway, we come to an end. I'd like to thank our three experts and guests. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you, guys. Thank you. And I'd like to thank the audience here in Brussels and those of you out there in cyberspace for joining us. Stay tuned for announcements for next month's panel discussion, and I thank you. Goodbye.